Hey, welcome back to AP Human Geography with Professor Dustin. Check it out. It's time for that agriculture test. So we're going to do a quick little review here and figure out what we need to know so that we can do well on the AP Human Geography test on the agriculture unit. So stick along with the ride. Here we go. Right off the get-go, one of the first things I spoke with you guys about in agriculture is the different sectors of the economy, and especially talking about the primary sector, because that's what agriculture is. Talking about primary, secondary, tertiary, okay, and then quaternary and quaternary. And so these different sectors of the economy refer to the different types of work that's being done. We also reviewed this when we started to introduce development in the course. And so primary sector jobs is anything that deals in being extracted from the earth, okay, like fishing or hunting or mining or lumber or any of these things. Agriculture, of course, being the main one we talked about in Chapter 10. So we also looked at secondary being any kind of a job that derives that includes manufacturing, right? It increased substantially as a portion of the economy during the or after the Industrial Revolution. And then finally, the tertiary sector of the economy has to do with services. But wait a second, there's all sorts of different types of services that can be done in an economy. Anything from being a store clerk to being a college professor to being a politician. So what's the difference here? Well, tertiary typically refers to the store clerk, servers at a restaurant, any of those kinds of base level service providers. Whereas if you're starting to talk about quaternary sector of the economy, you start looking at professionals or people that need advanced degrees or some kind of a certified training to get to, like a college professor or a doctor or a nurse or a teacher. Any of these things, okay? When you start looking at quaternary, you're looking at predominantly elected officials or people that are the decision makers in a government. And so that's what we mean when we talk about those different sectors of the economy, and that's what I'm looking for you guys to know for this upcoming test. We also spent a lot of time looking at some of these early hunter-gatherer people, and we discussed Jared Diamond's article, The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race, where he discusses the fact that for the majority of human history, we were hunter-gatherer nomads and traveled around from place to place, basically living off the land, trying to hunt, trying to gather stuff like roots and berries and things like that we can eat, and the agriculture comes later on and causes all these different problems. But what I want you guys to know about in terms of hunter-gatherer nomadism is that early human beings used a lot of tools. Okay, we talked about how you can do without services. You're looking back at the service economy or service sector economy, but you can't really do without tools or things that people make. You can't really do without extracting stuff from the earth, like food to eat, right? And so when you start to apply that to what hunter-gatherers were doing, they were smart enough with those big old brains they had to figure out ways to make tools to help them be better hunters and just live and survive. I mean, it's not like we're gonna go pick a fight with a lion or a wolf. We can't run faster than like a bear or a cheetah or any of these things. So we're outclassed completely. We're pretty weak when you think about it. The only thing we got going for us is our ability to use our heads to make tools and things that we can use to increase our success at hunting or gathering or whatever it is we might have done. And so you got to think about the types of tools we might have used to help us out with some of our hunting. Different types of bone tools for sewing and things like that. Also, you had basic clubs and things of this nature that will have been some of the first things people will have used in terms of creating things to help them with hunting. Okay. Also, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the importance of fire. Remember how we watched a video in class discussing that fire basically gives people the ability to scare off animals. It gives them a form of ability to cook their food so that they can have more nutrition and less of these baddies, in their food. Which my boy Dr. Oz in the video we were talking about, we watched it in class with introducing it's called The Story of All of Us, is what I'm trying to say. What it does is it decreases the amount of baddies or bacteria, things like this in the food, which gives us the ability to basically grow even smarter, get even bigger brains and things of this nature. So because of food, because of fire, we were able to have healthier diets and basically become even smarter and have more capacity to do for ourselves. So introducing the topic of agriculture, the first agricultural revolution, as we called it, or the Neolithic Revolution, either one is correct, we start looking at how people started to shift from this form of hunter-gatherer nomadism to eventually establishing settled societies over time. Some of your earlier types of agriculture may have included things such as shifting agriculture, for example. But eventually, what agriculture is going to do is it's going to allow people to store lots of food and stay in one place, which gives them the ability to be more creative, and also starts to give people different elements of cultural, I guess, their cultural identity. You start to see leadership emerge. You start to see other forms of creativity. You start to see where people might have different classes or social stratification within some of these villages. All right. One thing you're not going to see, or another thing you're going to see rather, is an increase of population starting with the growth of agriculture. Now, it's not going to be anything like the second agricultural revolution, but you are going to see where people gradually kind of live a little bit longer, and the world population begins to increase after the invention of agriculture. The second agricultural revolution precedes the Industrial Revolution and actually does kind of help to cause this massive jump in population. The second agricultural revolution starts at the end of the 1600s, early 1700s. Like I said, it predates the Industrial Revolution and then kind of piggybacks on industrial inventions and things like that, which then find their way back to agriculture. So after an industry emerged, you see not only consumer goods and textiles and things like this becoming revamped and redone for the sake of making money, but you also see that applied back into agriculture with inventions like Eli Whitney's cotton gin and Jethro Tull's seed drill and other types of tools that are used for commercial farming today. Another thing we discussed is the imperial or the colonial powers and their influence over the territories that they took over and basically colonized and exploited during the age of imperialism. And so how does that impact what crops are grown there? Well, still even today, many of those places will grow the same crops that they grew whenever they were being controlled by colonial powers, so like the Europeans. And not only that, but even today, many of those countries are unable to not grow those crops because of competition. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if they didn't grow those crops, then that would basically make the Europeans perhaps more likely that they would start to grow those crops or find those crops elsewhere. So in terms of the types of plantation crops or things like that, like coffee, for example, that's grown in some African countries, much of that is going to continue to be grown because and also the prices of those things controlled by colonial powers due to the demand and due to the fact that colonial powers can find that stuff elsewhere. Unlike, for example, if you look at oil, whereas the Middle East and the OPEC nations can control whatever price they want oil to be simply due to the fact that where else are you going to get it? And so there's not enough leeway with oil. But for example, if you're looking at agriculture, crops can be grown in other places that are suitable to sustain that crop growth. We also talked about the differences between extensive and intensive farming. The extensive being something that is done over a huge amount of land, and intensive being something that's done over a small amount of land. You can still produce tons of crops using intensive agriculture, but then we also discussed the differences between commercial and subsistence agriculture. And so a good example of commercial agriculture might be dairy farming, which is also a form of intensive commercial agriculture. Whereas a good example of subsistence agriculture that is also intensive might be rice farming in places like China or in Eastern Asia, where people are engaged in backbreaking labor trying to produce high yields of crops on a very small plot of land. So we discussed these things. We also looked at it in the context of extensive commercial agriculture and von Thunen's model. So just to kind of quickly rehash that, there were several different circles that represented what parts of farming or types of farming were going to be done relative to the market. And so I wanted you guys to be familiar with the von Thunen model. I'm not going to mention that right now, but there is definitely a video on my YouTube channel that's linked to understanding von Thunen, and you can find many different explanations of this in your just by doing a simple Google search. I'm not going to ask you guys to know a heck of a lot about it, but I do want you to know basically which circles represent which types of market crops. I also want you guys to be familiar with dairy farming, which we spent a little bit of time looking at that. In particular, I want you guys to understand that dairy farming is predominantly done in the United States Dairy Belt region, which is in around the Great Lakes and the New England states of the United States. And so those are some things that I discussed I wanted you guys to be familiar with. Another thing is the example of integrated livestock slash your livestock and your crop farming that's done at the same time, because what do they do? Well, they use the different types of corn silage which they would produce locally on their dairy farms to feed the cows that they produce, that produces their milk. And so what they do is, rather than have to buy the food from somewhere else, they grow their own corn or their own crops to feed to the animals. We already discussed how corn is predominantly grown in the United States for the sake of feeding cattle. Looking back briefly at the idea of colonial powers and their colonies, I wanted you also to be familiar with the fact that India, which is the jewel of the crown, as we discussed in class, in Great Britain's empire that the sun never set on, was basically today is a major cotton producer, and owes that to their colonial conquest, as well as other elements of the culture there, which we discussed. But in terms of agriculture, I wanted you guys to know that during colonialism, Great Britain became dependent upon some of the raw materials they got directly from, or imported directly from, India. And then after the fact, they continued, as I mentioned earlier in this video, to produce some of those same crops, because there's a high demand for it. Right? And so I wanted to tell you about that. I also wanted to tell you a little bit about the township and range survey system. We talked about meets and bounds and township and range in one of my other instructional videos, and so I was going to ask you guys some questions a little bit about how that is laid out, and in particular I'd be able to identify where in the United States they might have used these different two forms of survey systems to decide boundaries and things like that. So those are some things I wanted you guys to be familiar with. Lastly, one more thing I wanted to talk about wrapping up the video is the idea that women are the ones that predominantly control what's being produced in many of the farms that are located in some African countries. All right, men oftentimes might go out into the market and try to sell some of the goods, or might spend a lot of time doing work and in the cities and leave their families alone, where the women in fact will run the farm and handle just about all the work that gets done there. And yet women are considered to be equal, or I guess unequal to men, and less than men in those societies. And so that's something that's really kind of important and sad that we discussed. I talked about in one of my instruction videos, and also showed you guys another video that dealt with that. But I wanted to point out to you guys, in addition to what we just now discussed with plantation farming, the idea that plantation farming really took off as an early form of commercial farming, even before the Industrial Revolution, because of the fact that, one, they had cheap labor, aka slaves, that they used. Also, if you look at the types of crops that were grown in many of the Caribbean colonies, for example, in the earlier age of exploration, many of those crops are better suited for those areas. For example, sugar might have been grown to some extent within the Mediterranean region, but once you start to grow it in some of the islands in the Caribbean, it took hold way better than it did in those other areas. And so it's very, very important to know that many of the plantation crops were grown in those areas because of the fact that the land supported them, and because they had a large pool of basically slaves that would do all the work for them. All right, and so we discussed that. I want to tell you real quick definition of what horticulture is, because we never actually discussed. I haven't explained that in any of my other videos, but I have talked about it in passing in class. And horticulture is basically like flowers or different types of vegetables that spoil very, very fast. And so oftentimes, looking at Von Thunen's model, this is where we talked about things like your market vegetables, but also you can put flowers in there as well. And so moving on, almost done with this review. I wanted to end with the fact that urbanization and other things, but in particular urbanization is threatening farmland all over, especially the developed world, because of the fact that, well, it's no secret that if you want to farm, you're going to go to the place that has the best farmland, the place that you can grow the most crops and get the most bang for the buck. Well, if you start to live close to that land or on that land, and then all of a sudden your city starts to grow even bigger and urbanization begins to occur, what's going to happen really fast is you're going to start filling up all that farmland with apartments and condos and houses and little urban sprawly little neighborhoods and things like that. that's going to take away from your farmland. And so what you see over time is a decrease, and even today further decreasing amount of farmland on Earth, in particular in your developed countries. And so I wanted to point that out to you guys as a potential problem. Other potential problems that we discussed is like desertification, for example, where you continue to see where maybe bad agricultural practices leads to farmland becoming unusable for producing farms. Maybe they become like deserts, or you also see where unarable land begins to expand even further. And so there you go. That wraps it up. I wanted to make this video for you guys so y'all can have a little bit to look at and study for the agriculture unit. I hope that you got something out of it, and stay tuned. Thank you very much.